6 years ago, my father forged my signature on a disinheritance decree and told me I'd die poor helping losers. I didn't scream. I didn't beg. I just watched him smirk as he handed my entire future to my sister, Greer. Last Tuesday, that same man stood at a podium in a room full of the world's most powerful investors, sweating through his $5,000 suit as he tried to lie his way out of a multi-billion-dollar collapse. He thought he was about to save his empire. Then, the giant screens behind him flickered. My face appeared, calm, cold, and holding every receipt he thought he'd burned. As the board voted to strip him of everything, I walked through the double doors. He didn't even recognize the worthless daughter he'd discarded until I sat in his chair and whispered the only words that mattered: "Security is waiting for you in the lobby." Silas. To understand how a ghost takes over a hedge fund, you have to go back to the morning the first domino fell. It was a freezing October dawn when my Aunt Sloane, the only person Silas ever feared, sent me a handwritten letter from a hospice bed in Vermont. My father, Silas Rhodes, a man who measured human souls in basis points, had bankrupted his own sister a decade ago in a legal war over a family estate. He thought he'd silenced her forever. He was wrong. When I arrived at the Rhodes mansion that afternoon, the air was thick with the scent of expensive cigars and unearned confidence. Silas was in his study. 60 years of practiced ruthlessness etched into his face, already celebrating a record-breaking quarter with Greer. My sister stood beside him like a polished predator in a designer blazer, her emerald eyes tracking my every move. They looked like a fortress, impenetrable and elite. I stood in the doorway, the daughter who chose social work over Shark Tank finance, holding a secret that would eventually turn their gilded world into ash. The last time I saw Aunt Sloane, she had gripped my wrist with a strength that belied her frail frame. "Tamsin," she'd whispered, her voice a dry rasp. "He thinks he's erased you, but he forgot one thing. I kept the records. I kept the shares. And I kept the truth about what he did to us. You wait for the moment he thinks he's won, and then you end it. I've been waiting for 6 years. And the wait is finally over." The Rhodes annual gala was always a sea of black tuxedos and sparkling diamonds. I stood near a tall marble pillar, feeling very small in my simple dress. My father, Silas, stood in the center of the room. He was surrounded by his top investors, men who laughed at jokes that weren't even funny. I could see my sister, Greer, right by his side. She looked perfect, nodding along as Silas bragged about their latest millions. "And here she is," Silas said, his voice booming as he noticed me. He didn't sound proud. He sounded like he was introducing a mistake. The group of investors turned toward me. Their eyes were cold and judgmental. One man, holding a glass of expensive champagne, asked what I did at the firm. "I don't work at the firm," I said quietly, trying to keep my voice steady. "I just finished my degree in social work. I want to help people in the community." The silence that followed was heavy. Then, the man chuckled. "Social work? So, you're going to spend your life giving away other people's money to folks who didn't earn it?" A few others joined in the laughter. Greer didn't defend me. She just tucked a strand of hair behind her ear and looked away, a small smirk on her lips. My father stepped closer, his face turning a hard, stony gray. He didn't care that his friends were mocking me. He only cared that I was embarrassing his brand. He leaned in, making sure the investors could hear his every word. "You see?" Silas said to the group. "I raised a daughter who thinks feelings are a currency. She spent 4 years learning how to be a professional beggar." He turned his eyes back to me, and for a moment, the room felt like it had dropped 20 degrees. "I've spent my life building an empire of gold, and you've chosen to be the trash that litters it. You are worthless, Tamsin. You'll die poor helping losers." The words felt like a physical blow. My face burned, and for a second, I thought I might cry. But then I looked at Greer, who was already whispering a new tip to one of the investors. I looked at the finance king and realized he didn't see a daughter, he saw a bad investment. I didn't say anything. I just stood there in the center of the golden room, watching them laugh. I let the word worthless sink in until it didn't hurt anymore. It became a quiet, cold promise. They thought they were watching me fail, but I was just starting to take notes. A few weeks after the gala, I was in the library late at night. I was looking for some old school papers, but I found something else instead. It was a folder left open on Greer's desk. As I looked at the pages, my heart started to beat fast. I saw a list of names, ordinary people who had trusted our family with their life savings. Next to their names were rows of numbers showing money moving out of their accounts and into a private bank account owned by Greer. It was embezzlement. My sister wasn't just a golden child, she was a thief stealing from people who had worked hard their whole lives. I knew I had to tell my father. I thought that even Silas, with all his cold rules about money, would want to stop someone from stealing from his own company. I walked into his office with the papers in my hand. My voice shook as I explained what Greer was doing. I told him that innocent people were losing everything because of her. Silas didn't look shocked. He didn't even look angry at Greer. He just took the papers from my hand and tossed them into the shredder. "Greer is doing what is necessary to keep this firm ahead," he said, his voice flat and icy. "You, on the other hand, are a snitch who doesn't understand how the real world works." Before I could say a word, he pulled a stack of legal papers from his drawer. He slid them across the desk toward me. My eyes blurred as I read the words. It was a disinheritance decree, claiming I was giving up every cent and every right to the road's name. At the bottom was my signature. It looked exactly like my handwriting, but I had never signed it. He had forged it. "You wanted to help the losers of the world, Tamsin? Now you can go join them," Silas said. He stood up and pointed toward the door. "You are no longer a Rhodes. You have 10 minutes to pack a bag and get out of my sight. You'll die poor helping people who don't matter." I looked at Greer, who was standing in the doorway with a satisfied smile. She didn't feel bad at all. I didn't cry in front of them. I went to my room, grabbed a small backpack, and walked out into the rain. I didn't have a penny to my name, and my own father had erased me. As the heavy iron gates of the mansion clicked shut behind me, I realized the man who called me worthless had just made his biggest mistake. He thought he had destroyed me, but he had set me free to become his worst nightmare. The apartment I found was a far cry from the marble floors and soaring ceilings of the Rhodes mansion. It was a cramped, one-room studio on the edge of the city where the walls were thin enough to hear the neighbors' televisions and the heater hummed like a broken engine. I had no furniture, only a sleeping bag and a small wooden desk I found on a sidewalk. For the first time in 22 years, My father wasn't there to tell me what I was worth, but the silence of that room was heavy. I was alone, hidden in a place Silas would never think to look because he believed it was beneath his dignity. I spent my days working as a humble clerk in a grocery store, a job Silas would have called peasant work. But at night, the worthless daughter became someone else. I sat at my desk with a cheap, used laptop and began to build a digital ghost. I knew I had to be careful. My father had connections in every bank and government office, so I couldn't use my real name. I chose a pseudonym, reversing my initials and using my mother's maiden name. To the world, I was just a ghost in the machine, a shadow with a keyboard. I started a blog dedicated to one thing, the truth. I began by uploading the transaction records I had memorized from Greer's desk that final night. I didn't use fancy finance talk that was meant to confuse people. Instead, I explained in plain English how the Vance/Rhodes Fund was quietly bleeding its clients dry. I wrote about the small-town teachers and retired nurses whose life savings were disappearing into my sister's designer handbags and my father's offshore accounts. I used the skills I learned in social work to tell their human stories, but I used the math I learned in my father's house to prove the crimes. It was a cold, surgical combination. At first, nobody listened. My view counts were in the single digits, and I felt like I was shouting into a void. But I was patient. I had learned how to wait from watching my father track his stocks. I took the tiny bits of money I saved from my grocery store shifts and began putting them into ethical, sustainable funds, the kind Silas called weak and unprofitable. I was betting on the world he hated. My first big break came when a major financial magazine linked to one of my posts about the Rhodes leak. An editor described my writing as the most dangerous financial journalism of the decade. I sat in my dark, cold room and smiled. Silas thought I was dying poor, but I was building a library of his sins. Every time I hit the publish button, I felt a spark of power return to my chest. He had called me a loser, but he didn't realize that a person with nothing left to lose is the most dangerous person in the world. I was a ghost now, and I was going to haunt his empire until there was nothing left but dust. For years into my life as a ghost, a letter arrived that changed everything. It wasn't an email or a digital notification, but a real piece of cream-colored paper with a stamp from Vermont. The handwriting was shaky but elegant. It was from Aunt Sloane, my father's younger sister. Silas had told me she was a failed dreamer who lost everything because she wasn't tough enough for the family business. In reality, he had bankrupted her years ago during a cruel legal battle over their mother's estate. He had discarded her, just like he had discarded me. I drove 6 hours in my beat-up car to a quiet hospice house tucked away in the Green Mountains. When I walked into her room, the air smelled like lavender and old books. Sloane looked small and frail against the white pillows, but her eyes were still sharp and bright. She didn't call me a loser. She didn't ask how much money I was making. She simply reached out, took my hand in hers, and whispered, "I've been reading your blog, Tamsin. I knew it was you from the very first sentence." She reached under her pillow and pulled out a small, silver thumb drive tied to a silk ribbon. "Silas thinks he erased us both," she said, her voice a dry rasp. "He thinks because he took our names off the legal papers, we no longer exist. But I was the one who helped him set up his original fund. I kept the founding shares, and I kept the proof of how he stole them." Sloane explained that she was leaving me her entire stake in the Rhodes Fund, a massive amount of power that Silas thought had been destroyed decades ago. But there was a catch. To unlock the shares, I had to prove that Silas was morally unfit to lead. She called it a dead man's switch. The moment she passed away, a legal timer would start. If I could provide evidence of his abuse and his crimes to the board of directors within that window, the shares would legally transfer to me. He called you worthless because he's afraid of what you actually are, Sloane said, her grip tightening on my hand. You are the conscience he tried to kill. Use this. Don't just take his money, Tamsin. Take his chair. I left that room with the silver drive tucked safely in my pocket. As I drove back to my tiny apartment, the weight of the drive felt like a weapon. I wasn't just a journalist anymore, and I wasn't just a ghost. I was an heir. Aunt Sloane had given me the keys to the kingdom, and all I had to do was wait for the king to trip over his own greed. Silas always said that family was a liability, but he was about to find out that the family he betrayed was the only thing that could truly bring him down. Back in my tiny apartment, the silver thumb drive sat on my desk like a sleeping bomb. I spent a long time just staring at it, my heart thumping against my ribs. Aunt Sloane had called it a dead man's switch, and now that she was gone, the clock was ticking. I plugged the drive into my laptop, and a list of audio files appeared on the screen. They were labeled with dates going back years, recordings from the private therapy sessions Silas thought were completely secret. I put on my headphones and pressed play. At first, there was only the sound of a clock ticking and the rustle of papers. Then, my father's voice filled my ears. It wasn't the booming, confident voice he used in boardrooms. It was lower, colder, and full of a dark kind of pride. He was talking to a doctor about his business, but he wasn't looking for help. He was bragging. Tamsin is a leak in the boat, I heard him say. His words were sharp, like glass cutting through the air. She has this soft heart that makes her dangerous to the firm. I can't just fire her. I have to break her. I'll make sure she leaves with nothing, not even her own name. By the time I'm done, she'll be so convinced she's worthless that she won't even try to fight back. The room felt like it was spinning. I closed my eyes and leaned back, listening as he admitted to more. He talked about moving numbers to cover up Greer's mistakes, and how he had forged my signature because I was too weak to handle the truth. He laughed, a short, dry sound, as he told the doctor that I would probably end up working at a soup kitchen, thinking I was a hero while he sat on his mountain of stolen gold. For a moment, the old shame tried to bubble up in my throat. I felt like that 22-year-old girl again, standing in the rain outside the mansion gates. But then I looked at the screen. The files weren't just memories, they were evidence. Silas had documented his own crimes and his own cruelty. He thought he was breaking me, but all he did was give me the exact map I needed to destroy him. I sat there in the dark for hours, listening to every tape until my ears hurt. I didn't cry. Instead, I started a new file on my computer. I began to organize the recordings alongside the financial leaks I had already gathered. My father had spent his whole life building a wall of silence around his lies, but Aunt Sloane had handed me the sledgehammer. I wasn't the finance king's trash anymore. I was the storm that was coming for his throne, and for the first time in 6 years, I knew exactly how to end his reign. The news reports started to change. The Rhodes Fund, once a mountain of gold that no one could touch, began to shake. My blog posts were working. Every time I shared a new secret about my father's lies, another big investor got scared and pulled their money out. The stock price dropped like a stone falling into a deep well. Silas was used to being the hunter, but for the first time in his life, he was the one being hunted. He didn't know the ghost he was running from was the daughter he had thrown away. I sat in my small room, watching the numbers on my screen turn red. Silas was desperate. He put out a secret call to the financial world, begging for an anonymous investor to save his company. He needed someone to buy his massive debt so he wouldn't go bankrupt. He was willing to sign anything and give up any amount of power just to keep his name on the building. He thought he was looking for a partner, but he was looking for a rope. I knew this was my moment. I used the money I had grown through my careful, honest investments and set up a shell company. This is a business that exists on paper to hide who is really behind it. I named the company the SR Legacy, a private joke that only I would understand. Through my lawyers, I sent an offer to Silas. I told him I would buy his debt and save his fund, but only if he signed a contract giving my company the power to take over if he made one more mistake. Silas didn't even ask who I was. He was too proud to admit he was failing and too scared to lose his throne. He signed the papers in a hurry, probably laughing at how he had found another sucker to trick. He thought he had found a lifesaver, but I had just bought the very ground he stood on. He owed me now. Every suit he wore and every meal he ate was paid for by the daughter he called worthless. I watched a video of him leaving his office that day. He looked tired, but he still had that mean smirk on his face. He thought he had won again. He didn't realize that I now held the keys to his front door. I wasn't just watching him from the shadows anymore. I was the person he worked for. I closed my laptop and felt a cold, quiet peace. The trap was set, and Silas was walking right into the center of it, thinking he was the king of the world. The invitation came on a thick card that smelled like my father's expensive office. Silas wanted a family reconciliation dinner. I knew it was a lie. He didn't want his daughter back. He wanted to see if I was desperate enough to give him information about the market rumors destroying his fund. I accepted, not because I missed him, but because I wanted to see the cracks in his armor up close. When I walked into the dining room of the Rhodes mansion, everything looked exactly the same, yet entirely different. The gold plates were still there, but the air felt heavy and cold. Silas sat at the head of the table, trying to look like a king, but his eyes were tired and his hands shook slightly as he poured his wine. Greer sat to his right, wearing a bright red dress that screamed for attention. She looked at me and immediately started to laugh. "Oh, Tamsin," she said, waving a hand at my plain black outfit. "I see social work hasn't been kind to your closet. Did you find that suit in a bargain bin? It's so empty." I didn't tell her that my suit was a custom piece of minimalist couture, worth more than her car. I didn't tell her that the cheap fabric was actually rare silk. To her, power had to be loud and flashy. To me, power was being able to walk into a room and own it without saying a single word. I simply pulled out my chair and sat down, keeping my face as still as a frozen lake. Silas cleared his throat, leaning forward with a fake smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Tamsin, I've been thinking. I was a bit hard on you 6 years ago. Maybe there's a place for you back at the firm. We're going through a small rough patch, and family should stick together." He was fishing for help. He was begging the worthless daughter to save the empire he had built on her back. I watched him struggle to stay polite, knowing that every cent he was using to pay for this dinner actually belonged to my shell company. I didn't say yes. I didn't say no. I just picked up my fork and began to eat in total silence. Greer kept talking, mocking my hair and my boring life, trying to get a reaction. But I just watched them. I watched the way Silas jumped every time his phone buzzed. I watched the way Greer's smile didn't quite hide the fear in her eyes. They were like people on a sinking ship trying to brag about the view. By the time the meal was over, I realized they weren't my family anymore. They were just two people who had run out of time. I stood up, thanked them for the meal, and walked out into the night, leaving them alone in their golden cage. The grand hall was filled with hundreds of people in expensive suits, and the bright lights of global TV cameras made everything look like a movie set. Silas stood at the podium, looking every bit like the King of Wall Street. He had spent weeks telling the news that his fund was stronger than ever. Today was his big day. He was going to announce a massive buyback of shares using the money from my anonymous investment. He thought he was about to prove to the world that he had won and that his critics were wrong. I sat in the very back row, wearing my dark suit and keeping my head down. Nobody noticed me. To them, I was just another face in the crowd, exactly the way Silas had always wanted it. Beside him on the stage, Greer stood tall, smiling for the cameras in a dress that cost more than a small house. She looked like she was already celebrating their victory. Silas cleared his throat, leaning into the microphone with a smug grin. "Ladies and gentlemen," Silas began, his voice booming through the speakers. "There have been many rumors about the Rhodes Fund. People said we were failing. They said we were finished. But as you can see, we are standing taller than ever. Today, I am here to announce a move that will change this industry forever." He signaled for his assistant to start the presentation. Behind him, a massive digital screen came to life. Silas turned slightly, ready to show the world the numbers that would save his reputation. He was about to tell a lie so big that it would bury the truth forever. But as he opened his mouth to speak, the screen didn't show the financial charts he expected. Instead, the bright blue light of the presentation turned into a chaotic scramble of static. The high-pitched sound of a digital glitch echoed through the hall, making the audience jump. Silas froze. He tapped the podium, looking back at the tech team with a glare, but they were staring at their monitors in panic. The live TV feed, which was being watched by millions of people around the world, began to flicker with a strange, dark purple light. Suddenly, the static cleared. The room went dead silent. It wasn't a graph or a chart on the screen anymore. It was a single, high-definition image of a document, the forged disinheritance paper with my fake signature. Below it, in giant red letters that everyone could read, were the words, "The truth is irrevocable." Silas gripped the edges of the podium so hard his knuckles turned white. He looked like he had seen a ghost. I leaned back in my chair, my heart beating with a cold, steady rhythm. The digital ghost had finally arrived at the party, and I was just getting started. The room was so quiet you could hear the hum of the cooling fans and the cameras. Silas stood frozen at the podium, staring at the forged signature on the giant screen. Before he could find his voice, the image shifted. A new video began to play. It was the recording from the therapy tapes. My father's cold, sharp voice filled the hall, boasting about how he had planned to break me and how he had covered up Greer's crimes. Behind him on the stage, Greer's face turned white. She looked like she wanted to run, but every camera in the room was pointed directly at her. "This is a lie!" Silas finally screamed, his voice cracking. "This is a hack. Someone is trying to destroy me." But the screen changed again. This time, it showed the legal documents from Aunt Sloane's dying declaration and the proof that my shell company now owned his debt. The board of directors began to whisper loudly. They looked at the evidence of insider trading and the recordings of his abuse. The chairman of the board stood up, his face hard and serious. He didn't even look at Silas. He looked at the security guards by the door and nodded. "Mr. Rhodes," the chairman said, his voice echoing through the hall. "You are no longer the CEO of this company. You are a liability. Please leave the building immediately." The audience gasped as two large security guards stepped onto the stage. Silas tried to fight them, his expensive tie loosened and his hair messy, but they gripped his arms firmly. He looked smaller than I had ever seen him. As they began to lead him away, he looked out into the crowd, his eyes searching for someone to help him. That was when I stood up. I walked slowly down the center aisle, my heels clicking on the floor with a steady, confident beat. I climbed the stairs to the stage just as Silas was being marched toward the back of the hall. We locked eyes for a single second. He looked stunned, his mouth hanging open in a silent, broken gasp. He finally recognized the worthless daughter he had thrown away 6 years ago. I didn't say a word to him as he was escorted out into the street where the police were waiting. I walked over to the high-backed leather chair at the head of the boardroom table, the chair he had sworn I would never deserve. I sat down and looked out at the room full of people. Greer was sobbing in the corner, but I didn't look at her. I leaned into the microphone, my face appearing on every screen in the building. I didn't need to shout. I just smiled a small, knowing smile. "My father spent years calling me worthless," I said, my voice calm and clear. "He thought he could erase me. But today, the truth has a new name. I'm not worthless, Dad. I'm the owner." I closed my laptop and looked at the space where he used to stand. The silence was finally mine, and it was the most beautiful thing I had ever heard. The first morning at the Rhodes Fund was quiet. I walked through the glass doors of the top floor, and the air felt different. It didn't smell like my father's expensive cigars anymore. The workers at their desks looked up, and for the first time, they didn't look afraid. They looked at me with respect. I went straight to the large corner office, the one Silas had used to build his empire of lies. I didn't change much, but I did bring one thing, the old, green armchair from Aunt Sloane's house. I placed it right by the window where the sun hit the floor. I spent the morning signing papers that would fix the mistakes Greer and Silas had made. We were giving back the money they had stolen from the retired teachers and the small-town nurses. It felt better than any profit Silas had ever bragged about. I wasn't just moving numbers on a screen, I was fixing lives. When the clock struck noon, I stepped away from my desk and took a deep breath. My father's name was still on the wall outside, but his shadow was finally gone. That afternoon, I drove out to the countryside to visit the garden Aunt Sloane had loved so much. The spring flowers were starting to bloom, showing bright spots of yellow and purple against the green grass. I sat on a small stone bench and pulled a folded piece of paper from my pocket. It was the last letter Sloane had written to me. "I was just keeping the seat warm for you," it said in her shaky handwriting. I looked at the trees and felt a cold, quiet peace. I thought about Silas and Greer. My father was waiting for a trial, and my sister was facing her own legal battles. They were finally experiencing the worthless feeling they had tried to force on me. But I didn't feel happy about their pain. I just felt finished. I had spent 6 years waiting for this moment, and now that it was here, I realized the money and the power weren't the real prize. The real prize was being able to look in the mirror and know exactly who I was. As the sun began to set over the garden, I stood up and straightened my black blazer. I wasn't a ghost anymore, and I wasn't a victim. I was Tamsin Rhodes, the woman who had turned her father's biggest mistake into her greatest strength. I walked back to my car, ready to leave my company with a heart that Silas never understood. The silence was no longer a secret I had to keep, it was the foundation of the new life I was building, and it was stronger than any empire made of gold.